I just want to make a quick introduction. The next panel is entitled Big, Important, and Challenging. What should the United States do in countries where human rights promotion policies aren't working? So big, important, and challenging. That's what I told Steve Clemons that this was going to be, that this panel was going to be, and he said yes anyway. So we're very grateful to him. Steve is the publisher of the widely read blog, The Washington Note, and the founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, which aims to promote a new American internationalism that combines a tough mind and realism about America's interests in the world and a pragmatic idealism about the kind of world order best suited to America's democratic way of life. I love that mission. And I can't think of anybody better suited to guide us through this big, important, and challenging discussion than Steve Clemons. So, Steve, over to you.
Elisa, thank you very much. Folks, I hope you can hear us over here. I know we can hear you. I want folks to know we have two real rock stars in the human rights and democracy movements here with us today, and I want you to hear them. I want to get in a conversation with them and would love to involve you in that conversation as well. Of course, we have to my far right Aitzaz Ahsan, who is a member of the Pakistani Senate and a former president of the Supreme Court Bar Association of Pakistan. He has been jailed several times. I think many of you in this room who are here and focusing on we've just been talking in the back. I don't know if being in jail was sort of a price of entry, but there are a lot of you who have put yourself and your reputations and lives on the line, and certainly Aitzaz has for what he has believed. And then, of course, Garry Kasparov, who was a globally famous world chess champion who rose above that and put himself and his reputation very much at risk for issues and ideals greater than that. Of course, in Russia, as chairman of the United Civil Front. So we have got two great people here. And we've just been talking a little bit in the back green room about this question of what should the United States do to try to promote more human rights and democracy around the world. And we came to a conclusion that we're going to go at this question a bit backwards and go through the back door and start really with the question of what should the United States absolutely not do. And Garry, I'd love to start with you and get a quick snapshot of what you think the missteps, the failures, the blind spots that the United States has. Maybe by learning from what you perceive to be our failures, we'll get a little bit more of a direction on what a positive and constructive action plan might look like.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think we'll follow very much the lines of this great speech of Miriam, just we heard a few minutes ago. And she said, two key words, double standards. And I welcome the opportunity to present our views here, because many things we'll say today at this stage, they sound trivial for people in Russia or in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, but for many years, not decades, there were some sort of taboo in this neighborhood. And the willingness to discuss it openly, I think it's very important. And actually, I just had a very funny, observations. We were transferred from the hotel to the venue in a small bus with a sign, Human Rights Shuttle. And that's exactly what you shouldn't do. Human rights and shuttle diplomacy are not compatible. I think that it's if you cannot do a good job in promoting democracy, you rather do nothing. Because, applying double standards gives the force of democracy, and all these dictators now, modern dictators, they're much savvier than their classical predecessors, a really good, easy target to saying democracy, human rights, it's U.S. Agenda, it's an asset that they are using against our national interest, because you cannot explain to ordinary people, even for many of our activists, why some countries like Saudi Arabia are totally excluded from U.S. agenda, and others are in. How can you explain to people in Russia that Lukashenko is the last dictator in Europe and Putin is not? So if you cannot be as bold as Harry Truman, John Kennedy, or Ronald Reagan, rather do nothing by not selecting countries that may fit your current agenda, because by doing so you cause great damage.
Let me just push back just a little bit, and then I want to jump to Aitzaz to get his view. isn't the notion, even in the domestic political scene in the United States, of those struggling to create a human rights agenda or to focus the assets that a government may be deploying abroad, say in South Africa with the boycott or things like that. These are struggles, and one doesn't always know at the beginning of that struggle that one will win, that you'll seduce enough people in government to support that agenda. And so I'm interested in this binary approach you have, that if you're not serious, then don't try, because it means that you want to preempt to a certain degree that struggle internally to try to generate human rights advocacy in the United States. I mean, and what I'm differentiating between civil society, like Human Rights First, and the machinery of government itself. Yeah, you first, and then Aitzaz.
Now, I think that these modern authoritarian regimes and dictators, they know how to use these weaknesses of the Western world, because they understand how to attract the businesses, how to turn democracy into the bargaining chip. That's what, for instance, Putin did brilliantly. He always had a bunch of things at the geopolitical table, talking about oil, gas, Iranian nuclear program, other geopolitical issues, and democracy in Russia. It's all mixed. And then, the moment you start this negotiation, that's the cause is lost. And by doing certain things quite aggressively in some countries, obviously in a much smaller size and with less influence, and ignoring the big giants or U.S. allies, you send the wrong message. And you put us, who are trying to promote democracy and human rights in our countries in a very disadvantageous position. Because how can you tell people that Putin is not Democrat when, let's say, in 2006, he was hosting the G8 summit, being surrounded by Bush 43, by Blair, Chirac, Schroeder, Berlusconi. This is a picture. And of course, Kremlin propaganda always used it. Every opportunity to portray Putin as part of the exclusive group of the leaders of the democratic world. That's the greatest asset for Kremlin propaganda. And in other countries, they do the same. They're not like dictators in the past. It's not Soviet Union where the leaders didn't give a damn about the reaction of the West. So it was not a democracy. Now they say, want democracy, fine. You have elections, quote unquote, and you have all the institutions, but of course we understand it's all fake. But they need these windows of democracy to make sure their assets, you just mentioned them, assets abroad are safe, because they need to strengthen the rule inside the country. They need to offer a bureaucracy an opportunity to thrive outside of Russia or Pakistan or elsewhere, and to make sure that the funds they can allocate in their respective countries can be safely held in the Western banks and financial institutions.
Thank you. Aitzaz, that's a pretty big indictment, at least so far. Can you give us a snapshot of the things that you think the United States ought not to do in promoting, in thinking about promoting human rights?
Thank you, Steve. I think Garry proves 2 points. First, of course, he proves his point on the double standards and the counterproductive consequences that they create. But he also proves and establishes how great chess players can be precise and articulate, and how they can be so clear about the battlefield and where who is poised and who to strike first. I think he is very aptly and very concisely put things in perspective at the very outset. And it's a privilege to be on a podium with a gentleman like Garry Kasparov for me. But I think the 2 questions that you've raised so far are, first, what the United States must not do, and second, on whether, if one's not serious, must one continue trying or not. In the first instance, I think what the United States must not do and if we move on from do's to don'ts, first of all, I think the examples from Neguddin Diem to Shah of Iran on the one hand, and to Ziaul Haq and Musharraf and Putin on the other, established that regardless of how important and how necessary or essential a relationship with a military dictator might be, or a dictator might be, the United States must avoid embracing dictators. I think that is the lesson of Iran, that is the lesson of Vietnam, that is the lesson of Pakistan, that is the lesson that you will sadly learn in due course from Russia. Secondly, I think you must not, irrespective of how useful they might be in the current situation and today, must not embrace and dance with fundamentalist extremists. Remember, in the destruction, so-called destruction of the Soviet Union, your partners were Osama bin Laden and his colleagues. And they were described, his colleagues who today carry head money of together over $100 million, were described by the President of the United States in a White House banquet, and this included Osama bin Laden's colleagues, and officially described in the banquet in the presidential speech as the moral equivalents of the founding fathers of the United States of America. Now you are chasing those founding fathers and hounding them, and you want them dead or alive, and you are drowning them in the sea. Now, the second lesson I think to learn is that howsoever useful a fundamentalist, extremist regime or a military dictator might be, you must avoid contact with him. You must not necessarily, I do not say, interfere in the domestic affairs of a country, and you must necessarily to be partisan. That is not what is required. Our movements may be stronger if we are left to ourselves and not backed and patted on the shoulder by and seen to have the backing of the United States of America. The United States of America has a record that unfortunately is dismal across the world. Its embrace of the Noriegas and the Shahs of Iran have brought, and of Osama bin Laden in his own time. Every time I pass through an international airport, I realize what damage Osama bin Laden has done to this world. The number of millions of man-hours spent in taking off your shoes and your jackets and your belts.
Billions.
Yeah.
Billions of
man-hours. And probably in that respect he's successful. But he was your product. And then you must not abandon after what you think the battle has been won. You must not abandon your allies in the battle. You cannot walk the streets of Washington with a dog without a plastic paper bag and a plastic glove and a little shovel. Because you can't leave a dog dropping in any street in Washington. And yet you left mountains of dog droppings in the Afghanistan-Pakistan borderland area after the Soviet forces had withdrawn in February 1989. You just packed your bags and left. When democratic government came in, when we had defeated the generals in 1988, when Benazir Bhutto, the late Benazir Bhutto, established a democratic government, then all the sanctions of the United States began to be imposed. All pressures of the United States began to be exercised and applied to the democratic government, which were not applied to blue-eyed generals. We have had, since in our 65-year-old history, 34 years being ruled by military generals, brutal military generals, each supported fully, wholeheartedly by the United States. And yet, in the name of democracy, you straddle the world, and as Garry said, and as the young lady, the beautiful young lady from Bahrain said earlier in very articulate terms, a barrel of Saudi Arabian oil is not the price for a day's prison in Bahrain. We must, and the United States must, if it wants to remain the leader of the world, try to distinguish and reinterpret, revisit its own policies and apply single standards, not double standards.
Aitzaz, let's break that down for a minute and let's have a conversation amongst ourselves for a moment about that very important point. This week happens to be, I think it's Thursday, correct, I apologize for being wrong, the anniversary of Richard Holbrooke's death. Richard Holbrooke was a very famous, esteemed, I would call grandmaster champion for human rights, but he was ruthlessly committed to results. He was a Nixonian, he never liked this, but I called him the perfect amoral man, neither moral nor immoral, somewhere in between. But he was willing to do deals with the devil in order to achieve great gains. There's a movie out now about Abraham Lincoln in the United States, about the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. And when you get beyond the mystique of Lincoln, you saw Lincoln do very undemocratic things and engage in a massive power grab, manipulating a government in a massive usurpation to a certain degree of executive authority in government in order to achieve great gains. And it comes down to this issue of, you know, I think the pursuit, from my perspective, just to challenge you, human rights is hard to achieve everywhere because there is not a magic wand. There are limited resources. There are other issues in the world. And when I think about Holbrooke and what he did, he was willing to deal with the dictators of the world in order to try to carve out important gains for people's rights around the world. Is that something that you think is a non-starter from your perspective, Garry?
I'm just trying to mingle with all the points because there's so many great points made just here at the stage. And I think something that was said by Aitzaz Ahsan, I try to summarize it, it's much easier for the US, for the government, to put pressure on a weak, newly established democracy than on the ruthless dictatorship. And very often, for the sake of the record, they do that.
On the weak democracy.
Absolutely. Yeah, right. Because, as you said, you know, there's no magic wand. Things don't change overnight.
Right.
And it's a great temptation. So, oh, look, so many holes. You do not respect rules here and there, ignoring the fact that Abraham Lincoln and FDR and some of the great US leaders at the time of bare necessity, they probably not acted, you know, as perfect examples of human rights defenders. Also, yes, we should not let our words be misinterpreted saying, oh, they're arguing for cutting all ties with these bad guys. No, we never said that. The West has been doing great business with China. It is much more than with Russia. But no one, I never heard anybody, any political leader or a business leader, calling Chinese leaders Democrats. You know, it's business as usual. But you do not provide democratic credentials for Chinese leaders, giving him an extra ammunition to oppress their people. And then looking at the historic record, yes, it hasn't started with Richard Holbrooke. You go back to this all historic debate whether you can loosen the dictatorships by offering them, you know, trade concessions or other concessions. I never seen in history any successful implementation of that theory, period. It worked other way around. Jimmy Carter was not successful, Ronald Reagan was. So, and it's anytime we go back, I want to ask you about the results. Richard Holbrooke, for almost 20 years, 1, 2, 3, already the third American administration has been negotiating with North Korea. Could we stop them from providing nuclear weapons? No. Iran, for almost 15 years already, we're talking about it, and we know that it started with Putin's Russia, supplying them with nuclear technologies. Any success? No. And we can go on with this list. So if we want to look at the results, I'm very happy. I was a professional player, and I was very objective in analyzing the position. These policies always failed. It sounds nice in theory. It never worked in practice. So, and I can always remind of one of the Winston Churchill's greatest advices. In the time of the great crisis, always return to the first principle.
Aitzaz?
Well, I think Garry said it. What I was going to say myself was on Richard Holbrooke was ask you this counter question, did he succeed in anything? In the AFPAC region, he was inducted in as the great prophet of what can be done, what is doable, of pragmatism. And the AFPAC region, as you call it, the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, I think he died, so we have to talk kindly of him, but he was a complete failure. He isn't admired in Pakistan, and he isn't admired in Afghanistan, and he did not bring great credit to the United States of America. He just carried the big stick to Kabul and the big stick to Islamabad, and seemed always to be overbearing and domineering. Now,
I guess I knew the warmer side of Richard. But about Holbrooke, I asked Holbrooke about Vietnam. It's also interesting, I got a note from Senator Hagel today that 44 years ago today was the day he returned from Vietnam. And before Holbrooke died, about several months before, there was a release of a volume. We in the United States reconcile our history. We keep a lot of secrets, and then 25, 30 years later, we basically issue something called the Foreign Relations Volumes of the United States. And Richard, with Henry Kissinger and others, were reflecting on their early days as sort of young guys engaged in Vietnam. Richard at that time was responsible for trying to develop the civilian dimensions of trying to empower communities, look at the rights agenda in Vietnam, and viewed that a lot of his own work, whether people, it sounds like it didn't sell you very much, but if you ask Richard if he were here today, I think he would talk about crop conversions and talk about educating women and try to talk about other sorts of things. I don't blame Richard for AFPAC, because I think the president in my book was to blame. I was a very big critic of the Obama administration's direction on Afghanistan and Pakistan. That said, there are many in the human rights community who believe that deploying the military to Kandahar is what allowed many more women in Kandahar to go to school and to change at least the horizon of what their expectations is. And that's where I think, when you ask this question, and I don't want to belabor it too much, but it's the nexus between realism and the application of power to try to change the gravity inside another society, and whether there's an appropriate place or strategy for the United States to do that. And I'd love to just get, Garry, you're a strategist. You think in clear, unsentimental terms. What are the 3 or 4 things, if the United States wants to be more efficacious and practical in trying to achieve human rights outcomes in other countries, it ought to do? And so let's look at it, the constructive agenda. What ought America to do other than what I saw you say at the binary issue, that if you're not serious, don't try. If you are serious, then go ahead. There's got to be more to it than that.
Yes, but we should not be trapped by the argument that there are some geopolitical interests. It's realpolitik, and every president is limited by his actions, and there are so many evil forces in the world. We have to find the middle ground. I mean, just don't tell me that the challenges today are more dangerous and more explicit than those who Harry Truman faced in 1948 when he decided to save West Berlin against overwhelming odds, facing Stalin's army, not Brezhnev, not Putin, Stalin. And he saved West Berlin. He saved South Korea from being, from being enslaved by communist dictators of China and North Korea. And don't tell me that his odds were better than today. And, JFK in 1962 at the Caribbean crisis, or Reagan, tear down this wall. They faced threats, incompatible by the power of modern dictators. And moreover, they didn't have any leverage. What was the leverage against Mao Zedong? What was the leverage against Stalin or against Brezhnev? Today, there is a leverage because they keep money in the Western banks, in the Western financial institutions. They don't buy their villas and they don't buy soccer clubs or basketball clubs in China, Venezuela, or Iran. They buy it here. They buy it in the UK, in the continental Europe. They cannot survive without Western world offering them these opportunities for a luxurious life based on the money they have been siphoning out of their respective countries. Here in DC now, it's a moment when the...
So part of your action plan is to withdraw that...
Magnitsky law. Yeah. So it's a law named after a Russian lawyer who opened some of these criminal schemes of taking money out of Russia, and he was murdered in Russian jail. So it's the original version of that is known like S-1039, made in the Senate. Hopefully now, it will pass in its version made by the House. As much as I'm happy to see the version of this law approved, I'm still sad to see that it's limited now to Russia only. It should be as Jackson Vanik. It should be universal. It should affect everybody. And I understand why suddenly this current administration has changed its position, opposing Magnitsky law, because of this complete failure of the so-called reset policy. It was the most spectacular failure in foreign policy agenda of Obama administration. Now they're supporting Magnitsky law, but in a limited Russian version. And we know why. Because they don't want Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kazakhstan, or other dictators to be potentially included in the list, as it was, for instance, possible under Jackson Vanik amendments provisions. So you have a leverage. And you don't have to police Russia, Pakistan or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia. Police your own states. You have these guys, doing things that, and money allocated from these crimes being in this country or spread among U.S. allies. Try to do something to uphold your own laws and also prevent them from poisoning your financial institutions and business structures with money laundering.
Aitzaz, we were talking a little bit in the back about America's civil society institutions, promoters of democracy abroad, promoters of human rights. We have my friend Aryeh Nair, who for a long time ran the Open Society Institute. And I'd be interested to get both of your takes on how, from your offshore perspective, you see these efforts by groups, many of whose representatives are here today. What are they doing right? What are they doing wrong?
Well, Steve, first of all, my regrets to you and apologies to you if I hurt your sentiments on Holbrooke.
I'll survive.
I met him several times also, and I found him, he had, and I didn't, as I said, we in particularly the Muslim world don't like talking against recently deceased people. But this is a tell-all kind of a brutal kind of a session.
Richard I'm sure would wish he were here engaged in it.
Yes, and he and I were engaged in several conversations in Lahore and in Islamabad while he was alive. And I would say to him that not to intervene, not to interfere, not to be partisan in our favor, but that the rule of law movement, which was a popular, if you will remember from in 2007 when the Chief Justice was arrested, and it was a popular, it was a secular, it was a plural, it was a non-violent and sustained movement. It wasn't like just the Arab Spring, which was one spring and gone. From March 2007 to March 2009, until the judges were actually reinstated, we had a Tahrir Square every Thursday, and we did not select Friday because that would have religious undertones. And we had every Thursday a Tahrir Square in every city of Pakistan across the length and breadth of the country. That was a well-organized movement, and it was a hugely popular movement. And my perspective and Holbrook's perspective on the movement and on the judges was quite the opposite of each other. And he still thought that the hope of America and the world was General Pervez Musharraf, because he was fighting the war on terror. My perspective was that the most important combatant in a war is the population in the theater of war. And the population in the theater of war, the Pakistani and the Afghan population had, while they hated the Taliban and the tactics of Taliban of enslaving women, of brutalizing men, of imposing conformity of religion, of destroying plurality, which is historically Pakistani. And while I argued with him that Pakistan was a Muslim nation, yes, but it was not an Arab nation, it was not a Middle Eastern nation. So we, like the South Asians, we were more South Asians, and we, as South Asians, prided in our judiciary, and we were prepared to struggle and strive for our democracy. And that was historically true of us, because every military dictator that had been imposed upon us and that had been embraced by the United States, we had, as people of Pakistan, ultimately thrown him out through popular movements. So there was a difference of perspective, and I think that perspective is valid to this day in terms of the Pakistani situation. But without mentioning Holbrook any further, I would say that your question, if you're not serious, and this is what Garry has raised, a very pertinent question, you might as well not be in the business. I think that's true. Human rights business and human rights sort of struggle, it's not a business, it's a struggle, is a difficult one, particularly when you are brutalized by your own regimes, and as Marian was saying, ignored at the least by the international community. And you spend lonely years in jail. You spend lonely years where your wife and children are not allowed to see you, at least for a month. Once a month they are allowed to see you. And you see them grow in sort of fits and starts. After 6 months you get to see your children and they look different. And so it's an effort that requires dedicated support, not non-serious support. And even in Pakistan and in South Asia and in the world, I think the human rights movements have, to their disadvantage, moved from what was in the 60s and 70s. I remember in the 70s and 80s, when General Ziaul Haq took over, we used to display our anger and our resistance and our opposition to him by coming onto the streets. We were beaten up. We were beaten up by the police. We were tear gassed. We were baton charged. We were lifted and picked and thrown like dead cattle into the trucks, taken into jails, and we had to spend long years in jail without the habeas corpus writ being active. Today, the same anger and the same resistance has gone and housed itself in five-star hotels. And glossy publications come out of Pakistan and of other places showing leaders that have not done very much, but they've established contact with patrons in the United States, in Europe, in Britain, and that patronage brings in a lot of funding. So there has been a deterioration in the fight for human rights also. There has been a monetization of the human rights struggle. That, I think, the United States NGOs and United States non-government organizations and concerned with human rights should take stock of. And it's the grassroots ones who are struggling, who are still going to jail, who cannot afford glossy publications, and who cannot afford to hold meetings in five-star hotels, but hold meetings in cheap labor halls and at cheap venues, and are still being struck by police raids, etc., are the ones that have to be discovered and patronized.
Thank you. Garry?
I think it's probably time now to break with vicious circle, because now when we see these results of the revolutions,
Time for checkmate.
as you mentioned, we are probably not in a luxurious position to look for a checkmate. Many of our friends and colleagues, they are they're engaged in a tactical survival.
Right.
Yeah, we have to build
What
up
does
strong position.
tactical survival look like right now?
When we hear complaints about results of these revolutions, in Arab world or in other places, saying, look who is replacing Mubarak, Gaddafi, and you name it. Then what do we expect? Longer the dictator stays in power, worse the alternative. Mm-hmm. Just imagine, what they do with staying in power for 20, 30, 40 years. They are eradicating any political movement that can threaten them. So eventually, when dictator is overthrown, you have a political desert. Who throws in the desert? Oh, the worst creatures. You have rats, cockroaches, whatever. Who can survive there? And as was pointed out, U.S. bears certain responsibility for perpetuating this machine. More support they provide for Musharraf, the more popular anger, and more support for Musharraf, and he must become even tougher and tougher to suppress the public movement. More anger against him as an American ally. And it all ends up with anti-democratic forces taking over. You can't expect a liberal movement to win elections, even to be on a powerful seat as an opposition in the countries where dictators ruled ruthlessly for 20, 30, even 40 years. So that's a very important lesson.
Agree.
Yeah. So I think there are many opportunities now because of the social media. And I think also when we use such a powerful weapon, which can attract attention of not millions, maybe hundreds of millions, and eventually billions of people who live under the undemocratic rules and dictatorships, I mean, we should remember that their knowledge, even despite these modern technologies, their knowledge of outside world is quite limited. I know that even among our activists in Russia, very few, if any, can identify what the difference between IRI, NDI, NED, open society. It's all America. So American government, American business, it's all the United States. So, and that's what you should remember by just doing something, one major American corporation, let's say Microsoft, could do damage to the cause by cooperating with the government. And it seems irrelevant, and you understand that, the interest of the corporation may not, and very often is not, the part of the government's agenda. People on the ground don't understand it. Yeah, and it's every time the big corporation cuts a deal with the government on the ground, that's a card that the government of this respective country plays against democracy as a concept, saying, okay, it's United States. They always trade. So remove democracy from the bargaining table. Don't place it as a chip that can be used for business or geopolitical trade.
That's fascinating. So what would you do today in you mentioned Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, in which you've got messy transitions underway. I would say that, if you look at most of the previous Soviet Union and you looked at the transitions there, perhaps they were a little bit more slow motion, but many of them have turned out very disappointing, where people's rights have certainly been circumvented and undermined or going that direction, even in of course, Russia. But what's missing in the equation of getting transitions right? Because we can't take back the fact that we worked with Mubarak for 30 years. It's a done deal. So what do you do at that point? What do these groups in this room do? In my book, I've been basically arguing, much to the frustration of many friends here, they give Morsi some time. Because it did go from a situation where there was not a branch of government that wasn't stewarding Mubarak's interests. And when you move from that world to another, it's messy. And he may be a tyrant, another dictator in the making, and you don't get democracy as we would like it or know it right away, but you've got to figure out what the equation is to pump up other institutions, like the judiciary, like the media, like other institutions that can control and balance the power. That's my view. But I'm interested in when we think about human rights, and one of my friendly criticisms of some in the human rights community is separating impulse from an action plan. How do you get serious about an action plan when you have a transition in Egypt? We're going to have more transitions. We're going to have a transition in Syria, given the messiness there. So given your experience of being on the line with nasty brutes who have thrown you in jail, and you've still stayed strong to try to build institutions that have carried the will and support of the people, what is the best lesson you can give the United States and to American civil society institutions about managing these transitions better?
First of all, the first one that comes into mind is do not walk into the vacuum. Don't think there's a vacuum that has been created and the Americans can fix things. America is fix-all, Mr. Fix-all, and America can walk into the vacuum. It will get a bloody nose and a black eye in the process itself. Second, these processes take time. These days, of course, that time has shrunk enormously because of the social media that Garry mentioned, and I think he brought up a very important point in today's world, the difference that the world is today. Otherwise, I'm reminded of Prime Minister Chu En-lai's statement. He was asked by Oriana Fallaci in one of her interviews with History. He was asked one question among several other questions in this interview. One question was, she asked him, what Prime Minister, in your estimation, have been the effects of the French Revolution? And his answer was, too early to say, too early to say. That was really a man who had thought things out, a man who wouldn't rush things. There's another question that she didn't ask, but apparently he is said to have answered, which may be of some interest to Americans. Somebody asked, apparently Henry Kissinger reportedly asked him, at some point of time, what would have been, how would have history of the world shaped had instead of Kennedy, Mr. Khrushchev had died instead of President Kennedy in 1963. He thought for a moment and he said, well, Mr. Onassis would certainly not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. But do not walk into a vacuum. Let the people of that country sort out things for themselves. They'll tumble, they'll be rough, there'll be scrambles, there will be, you will feel your kind of high civilized position and civilized society and civilized norms will seem to be hurt, will seem to be outraged, but do not be taken and carried away with the temptation of moving in to repair things and to hold some hands when they don't need them to be held. They'll sort out things themselves in their own whichever that may be. You will make mess-ups like you did in Iran, trying to rescue prisoners and in the embassy. You will really take wrong decisions because you will not have been on the ground. You will be watching situations from the satellites through CNN, through BBC, and you will make decisions, wrong decisions. So first of all, my first advice in any such situation, be it Libya, Tunisia, Egypt yesterday, day before yesterday, Egypt yesterday, Egypt today, do not walk in, do not interfere, do not try to get hold of things and to shape them your way. The world will never be shaped the way, please realize, the world is a plural world, is a diverse world, from China to the United States, from Argentina to Russia. The world is from Indonesia to Morocco, even within the Muslim world. The world is diverse and plural. It is not a unipolar world, though we have a unipolar world in the terms of there being only one superpower. But that power must remember the world is not a unipolar, unilateral kind of a world. It's a unitary world. It's a plural world. There are different solutions which different people find for different situations in different regions amongst themselves. Let them find those solutions amongst themselves. So wait and see. And that would be my primary advice to the United States.
Thank you. Gary,
I couldn't agree more. I just wanted to add a couple of sentences. Yes.
But okay. I'm going to ask you in addition, because if you were a human rights focused Machiavelli advising the prince, in a different way, what would be your lineup? What would be the opener of that chapter? And then I'd like to go to questions in the audience.
Human rights Machiavellian advisor sounds like oxymoron to me. Because human rights either comes first or doesn't come at all. So it's, yeah, you mentioned US leadership in the world. I believe it could be only moral leadership today. And moral leadership means that you are sticking to your original principles that made you great at the first place. And in all the countries that were mentioned at this stage, during these 45 minutes, US has to regain trust of people. After so many years of siding with dictators, you can't expect them to make the right choices, but you have to respect these choices. My friend and colleague, Oleg Kozlovsky, who has been part of a movement in Russia for many years, he had confirmed that many times we had these debates in Russia, and people ask, now you want free and fair elections in Russia. What if the left-wing radicals, the nationalists, what if they win? And my answer was also quite discouraging for them. I said, we have to respect the results if it's a free and fair elections. That's what US must do. You have to respect the results. Because I believe that the popular vote is always a step forward. You may not like it, but it's still a step forward because people recognize they are responsible for their choices. And they will help eventually, maybe rather later than sooner, later than we want. But they are held responsible, the leaders they elect. And any interference at this infant stage of democracy makes things much worse. Because again, our enemies, the enemies of democracy, will have the same old argument that unfortunately works among crowd that never experienced democracy. United States uses democracy as a tool to promote its own geopolitical interest. Step aside and demand free and fair elections in the countries that do not fit the standards, even if these countries are your long-standing allies. So you cannot complain about results of elections in Egypt by not demanding Saudi Arabia to have free and fair elections as well. So unless you can promote universal standards of democracy and human rights, you will fail in the modern world. Because you, as we just discussed now, you are dealing with hundreds of millions of people who can learn about everything, even the words that are spoken in this room today, on internet. And when you have an Arab in a Bedouin in Arab desert, having access to more information, Winston Churchill and Albert Einstein combined, so you have to respect his decision. And showing this respect, I think eventually, maybe even sooner than we expect, eventually we'll have results. Because sticking to the principles, I believe it's the strongest weapon in our hands. That's why the West has won a Cold War. Not because nuclear weapons, Soviet Union had it as well, but because the principles worked out. And people knew behind the Iron Curtain that there were others who were showing solidarity and supporting them. Regaining this momentum, regaining this trust, I think it's a matter of utmost importance.
I happen to strongly agree with you, and I'd like to go to questions. I would remind some people here, some of you knew Sylvia Picado, who once made the comment, very interesting, who became a international human rights advocate, was based here in Washington, that after 9/11 in the United States, in which there was so much stress on American society, said you don't really know the norms of a society until you see it under stress, and the United States did not behave well. And that when you saw things like warrantless wiretaps on American citizens, you saw, in her view, many of the abuses of power that came as a result of 9/11 inside this country. She said symbolically you robbed legitimacy from people who had fought to take back their governments from generals and dictators. And I thought it was a very powerful comment that I wanted to share today. But let me start here. Is there a microphone? I haven't been told whether there is one. Oh, there is? So we'll go one here. And major thanks to the runners with these in advance. And then we'll go into this far corner in the back here. Yeah.
Thank you to the speakers. Kate Nahapetian with
I
the...
can't hear you, so there we go.
Thank you to the speakers. My name is Kate Nahapetian. I'm with the Armenian National Committee of America. And I had two questions. I think as long as countries that enable governments that abuse human rights profit from those policies, whether they're getting energy concessions or concessions on political policies that they are trying to pursue, they will continue. I think the answer is to create a cost for complicity in human rights abuses. I wanted to get your comments on that. And Mr. Kasparov, your family had to flee Azerbaijan because Armenians were being targeted during the Karabakh War. And a lot of people fear that Azerbaijan is preparing for war again because of the conflict has not been resolved. And Azerbaijan actually recently pardoned and promoted an axe murderer because he axed an Armenian to death in his sleep in Budapest. And I wanted to ask you, Mr. Kasparov, what you think the United States and Russia should do in response to that.
So Garry, the second question about your family in this situation, do you think there are options for what the United States and Russia should do in this case?
Look, again, it's a long story, and it's quite a painful story that involves my family and hundreds of thousands of Armenians who were born, raised, and live in Baku and in other places in Azerbaijan. In Baku, at least 250,000 that have been erased from the population. I mean, just they're kicked out. Many of them, of course, as we know, died during these terrible events more than 20 years ago. But it's very unfortunate that the conflict, Armenian and Azeri conflict, it's also part of this geopolitical agenda. And you just talked about energy concessions. But it's I don't know how to judge the situation because Russia is fully behind Armenia in this case, and the United States is trying to be neutral. But we know that there's a geopolitical interest in organizing an alternative pipeline that starts from Azerbaijan, goes to Georgia, Turkey. So that's why this conflict for me is very far from resolution, because both sides recognize that they are unfortunately pawns in these major in a major geopolitical chessboard. And I'm not very optimistic about the quick resolution of the conflict. But on the other side, I wouldn't be too worried about a real war that can break out again, because I think both governments in Baku and Yerevan, they will be too sensitive to their patrons in Moscow and Washington.
Any comments, Aitzaz? On the cost for complicity?
Well, the cost for complicity is real, and it's not necessarily immediate. That's why I gave the example of the French Revolution and Chu Enlai. These tend to have an effect over time. For instance, in the 1980s, when Pakistan was fighting the war against the Soviet army in Afghanistan, and it was supported, egged on and supported by the United States and Saudi Arabia, and all manner of non-nationals came to fight the war. Jihad was a word that had a high value. Today it has a negative value. It was a word that the Americans encouraged and in fact created an aura about jihad at that time, in those 10 years. But the repayment time for that is now. We were fighting that policy and resisting that policy because it was gradually Talibanizing the society. And I spent much of my time in jail trying to convince the authorities at home and friends abroad that this was a war in which Pakistan was taking wrong measures and using the wrong kind of people to fight the war. If the war had to be fought, it had to be fought by other means, not through mullahs and through fundamentalist extremists. But the cost of that was heavy on Pakistan in particular, on the population in the theater of war in particular, because we are now confronted with a suicide bomber, a new weapon that has been created. Every time a society has created has invented or devised a new weapon, whether it was bow and arrow or the machine gun or the aeroplane, the balance has tilted. Here the Taliban have the suicide bomber, who's a human being, looks like a human being but is a bomb. And how do you distinguish him? How do you keep him away from your public places, from your bazaars, from your shops, from your schools and colleges, etc.? So the cost is always there. There is no question of not having a cost to flawed
I assume
policy.
you say the same about drones.
I say the same about drones. The drones today are creating an anti-American sentiment, a widespread anti-American sentiment in Pakistan.
This gentleman in the far back. For some reason, these mics aren't on, so knock on the mic. I guess use your lungs.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go.
I've never been accused of not being able to use those.
I'll repeat it for the camera, so if we can keep it brief, that would be great.
Well, thank you for your eloquent remarks. Mr. Ahsan, among your remarks was countries need to sort themselves out internally. And Mr. Kasparov, you referred to the importance of the United States holding up human rights values. Many of us are concerned, specifically with regards to torture, that the United States has not done a particularly good job of think it would have if the United States, in a more methodical and clear way, had a true accounting and accountability for torture? And if you thought it did matter, how would you suggest tactically that we make that happen?
That's a very important question for the camera, since we're streaming live online. Millions of people watching. The question was, if the United States actually held those account, went through a process of looking itself and holding those to account for the practices of torture, what impact would that have on the international community? I'd love to get short, brief answers so we can get some other questions from both of you.
I think personally it would have a enormous, a dramatic effect if United States had really truly held the torture incidents and people who caused and created that torture, inflicted that torture in Abu Ghraib, for instance. If it had held them in account, the various incidents happening in Afghanistan by military personnel, if it were to hold them to account, it would have a dramatic effect to the torture that its allies and its allied regimes, allied dictatorships are capable of inflicting upon their own populations. It would dramatically reduce such incidents the world over.
Garry?
I'm less optimistic about the positive effect by the U.S. transparency. I'm all for it now, but it will not end the hypocrisy, because they'll say, okay, they confessed on these crimes because they committed many more. So it's no doubt that by some of the modern international standards, Eisenhower and Montgomery will be held accountable for the crimes against humanity by bombing Dresden, for instance. Yeah, and God forbid Dr. Goebbels couldn't be on CNN showing the bodies of dead German kids killed by these ruthless American and British planes. So I think we have to understand the limits. We're facing an enemy that will find a way to blame us for committing crimes. But of course, transparency is important, I think, for our own. I think it's just, we have to feel moral strength in arguing. And unless we are clean, or almost clean, so it's more difficult for us to communicate the message with the same passion and power of our argument.
Right. This gentleman right here. Oop. Ooh. Ooh. Wow. Are you okay? Great recovery.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Hey.
Sorry about that. My name is Madloum Marogi. I am the Chaldean Syriac Assyrian Council in Canada, representing Iraqi people, Christian. Yes, it's a very good question, important and challenge. What should the United States do in countries where human rights promotion policies aren't working? Yes, in Iraq, they are, they worked, but not whatever we would like to do or to work. We will not ask United States what you should do, but we will tell her what they would do, they should do in Iraq, especially in Iraq. First of all, protect people, security. There is no security there in Iraq. There is no jobs. Around 70%, they are underlined, they are the poorest people. There is no project, no buildings, no jobs, no schools, no hospitals, especially in Nineveh Plain. Nineveh Plain, it's between Mosul and north of Iraq. And they shouldn't deal with the government, like those governments they are going to in dictatorial way. The question to the human rights, where the human rights stand regarding to our people, especially the minorities people, Chaldean, Syriac, Assyrian, and Mandaean Yazidis. Thank you so much.
This is a a fascinating and important point, and it gets to some of what we were discussing earlier, which was when you have questions of security or basic institutional development inside the guts of another country, to what degree can an outside power, even like the United States, in which you want to play a role, or Europe to play a role? This is one of my big differences. I know Bob Kagan will be here. One of my big differences with some of my friends in the neoconservative camp is the neoconservative camp believes the United States has the ability and the power and the capacity to deeply embed itself in the DNA inside of another country and to produce outcomes. And I don't believe it's that easy, that there's blowback, that there are costs, that you delegitimate those that you're trying to succeed. So it's a very important question. I think there are different views, but I would love to get Garry and Aitzaz's view of this.
Now, I think it's bringing us back to the issue of complicity and how we can affect the leadership of certain countries and not to commit crimes or not to do things that are undemocratic or endangering human rights. I just want to emphasize, in my view, it's a very important point. So the Jackson-Lanning Amendment targeted the country, the whole country, for its leadership committing crimes and violating human rights. The Magnitsky Law is targeting individuals. And that's what we should do in every specific case, because it's easy now to identify these individuals. Every crime, whether it's torture or murdering innocent people or stealing money from the poor, has a name. We have all the information. Ask these people to provide you this data, and they will start, flouting you with these emails and SMSs. Collect the data and make sure that everybody who commits a crime, whether it's in Russia, in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Argentina, elsewhere, in any quarter in the world, will be held responsible. Because at the end of the day, all these crimes, or most of these crimes, they don't have the same zeal for power as for Stalin or Hitler, but more of enriching the perpetrators.
And then that might be the backdoor way of addressing this.
And they keep money here. So make sure they will know they will not escape. And the people who are suffering, they will be your allies. They'll provide you all information, more than necessary for the State Department and other respective institutions here and their colleagues in the European Union to make a block, to prevent these people of enjoying the luxurious life in the Western countries with the money they stole from their people.
I mean, this is, Anne-Marie Slaughter has written about and made this same point, that we live in a world of cell phones and the atomization of information, and that we should be in this day and age be able to create accountability on these fronts. Aitzaz, do you have a quick response to this gentleman?
Yeah, I think he's made a valid point, but I think I think America is far too sharper and perceptive than that. The Americans know when they can interfere and when they can change and create conditions. Like in Yugoslavia and Kosovo, there was direct bombardment and direct intervention, military intervention, and it succeeded. But against China, I would like to see America plan such a move. It will not be able to do that, irrespective of the human rights situation in China or with the Uyghurs, etc. But I think the Americans can discern. It's the gray area, the area between China, the difference between China and the difference between Kosovo. This is the vast two extreme ends of a spectrum. It's the gray area within where most of the world resides, and most of the world and most of the countries live and exist. It's in that area that the test of human rights and American commitment to human rights and American policy on human rights and how to go about it that occurs, that confronts America. And I think we've been basically focusing on that because Russia would fall in that category because it is a semblance of democracy, and it is believed to be a democracy in the United States, and hence America thinks it could be playing a role of some sort, strengthening Putin. Pakistan is now a democracy. after a long struggle, a long and hard and difficult struggle. But the Americans still miss their generals and are prepared to go and hold meetings, including the late Holbrooke. He would hold a more important meeting in the GHQ than with the President of Pakistan, a longer and more detailed meeting in the GHQ, which we as Pakistanis resented. But that has been the American policy of duality in everywhere except where it can either attack or not attack and not interfere at all.
Thank you. Let's take this last question here. Yeah.
Hi, oh, that's very loud. Francesca from the NGO Working Group for Women, Peace and Security. We've talked about accountability here, and we've brought up economics in our various panels this morning. And I think that if we speak about Russia, where business has been booming for the past 15 years, and we talk about what the United States can do, I think an important part of this discussion is the United States holding American companies accountable for their complicity in supporting the Russian government or their complicity in direct causing of human rights abuses in Russia. And I think an important aspect of the United States is not just in diplomacy and bargaining, but also in, as has been raised here, using the laws in this country to help promote and respect human rights in other countries as well. And I think that that is often overlooked when we talk about international relations here. And I wonder if anyone could expand on that.
Garry, let me ask you to go and take this, I think, important question. But I want to piggyback and ask a part B to what you've put out there, because I also see in the discussion about levers and leverage in global affairs a sense that if the U.S. decides to move one way or another, that it changes the way gravity works. And the fact is, in the oil and energy field, most of the large companies in the world are nationalized. And the leverage that U.S. firms, large that they may be and branded well, is significantly lower today than, say, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. And so one of the questions I have is one about whether or not, I don't know whether to call it humility or a sense of reality about the limits of that kind of leverage still makes it important to make the moves that this young woman just laid out. Garry?
Yeah, I have to mention that, of course, I disagree with the statement that the Russian economy is booming. So the GDP is growing, but by measuring GDP as sort of the main element of this growth, is like measuring the average temperature in a hospital. Yeah, Russian economy today is a big pipeline, and if by some estimates, Russian economy under Putin gained more than $1.5 trillion for exporting oil and gas. We don't see this money invested in Russia. So they are invested, west of Riga to London, and you can now start feeling this the power of this money even in this country. I don't think that we can solve all these problems due to this globalization of the economy, of the world economy, and legitimate interest of multinational corporations. But of course, while they're looking for the profits, there are certain questions to be asked. I can use this opportunity to ask Microsoft the question that bothers every political activist in Russia: have they released Skype codes to KGB, FSB? Mm-hmm. That's a big question. They never answered the question. And I want them just to be responsible if they did, because that endangers the lives of many people who rely on Skype as the only source of protected communication. And for many of my friends and colleagues in Russia, being protected during the conversation means, if not life and death, but definitely time in jail. And aiming at this oil curse, imagine for a second that we can eliminate this factor from the global politics. I'm not saying all money that comes from oil is bad, but most of the bad money comes from oil.
Right.
And if America, instead of spending $1 trillion or equivalent or something similar in Iraqi war, could have spent the same amount of money in eliminating oil as a factor. And I believe it could have a tremendous effect. Without oil today, we don't have Ahmadinejad with nuclear program, we don't have Putin, we don't have Chavez, you name it. So the triumph of the West, as we already pointed out, was based on the moral values, but also on the power of innovations. And playing the same old game, you know, it's just like oiling this global machinery and reproducing corruptions between dictators and multinational corporations that are just following their rules because they have to make a quick buck.
Right. Final word, 1 minute.
I think less than a minute. I think the point is most dramatically established the position of oil as a power broker, oil itself as a power broker, as a determiner of American policies and the world's policies, by the fact that, by the simple fact, and that's a fact, that 15 out of 19 suicide bombers of 9/11 belonged to Saudi Arabia, but there were no sanctions against Saudi Arabia. Afghanistan was bombed instead. There was no Afghan, there was no Pakistani in that conspiracy at all. And yet, the war was taken to a different theater altogether. That shows you the power of oil.
And on that optimistic note, I want to thank Senator Aitzaz Ahsan, Garry Kasparov for a fascinating, illuminating conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you, my friend. Excellent. Thank you.